Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, Tips for Mixing for Houses of Worship, presented by Jim Yakabuski. My name is Laura Lawrence and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Harman. Just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar. However, there is a Q&A function where you can submit questions to the presenter and he'll try to answer as many questions as possible. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be made available a few days after this presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control, and we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series that can be found on pro.harman.com. We're adding new sessions daily and have over 20 sessions scheduled for August and September, so watch for those on the calendar. Just a side note, today is our 90th session that we've held in this Learning Sessions series. So, yeah, it's a big milestone. And you can find all of those sessions out on our YouTube channels as well, because we do record all of them. And now I would like to introduce you to Jim, the presenter for today's webinar. Jim has 40 years of experience mixing front of house for artists like Journey, Gwen Stefani, Matchbox 20, Peter Frampton, Avril Lavigne, and Van Halen. He is also the author of Professional Sound Reinforcement Techniques and a contributing author to Live Sound International and Church Sound magazines. Now I'll pass it over to you, Jim.
All right, thank you, Laura. And welcome Raul Gonzalez as well, my amigo from 20 years in audio, and
it's great to be here with you, Jim, and welcome everybody again. Raul from Harman, our senior team. Thanks for joining us again on this 90th session. Great to have the one and only Jim Yakabuski. It's great to see you, Jim. We had a great time at the Super Bowl.
Yes, we did. We did. 3 weeks of a lot of laughs.
A lot of fun.
Yeah, surrounded by some talented people. So
we will get back.
Yes, I hope so. All right, everyone. Welcome to Tips for Mixing for Houses of Worship. I'll dive right in. My name is Jim Yakabuski, and there's my shining Parnelli Award, my one and only. One was enough, and if I never get another one, that's all right. And here's just a list of some of the things. As Laura said, 40 years mixing, almost 40. Started in early 1981 in Vancouver, mixing for bar bands and really making a mess of it for quite a while until I learned a few things. But recently, I've been working with Gwen Stefani, many years with Peter Frampton, Journey, Matchbox, Avril Lavigne, and way back in the 90s, I spent 8 years with Van Halen, which was, you can imagine, was absolutely amazing. I spent a few years as the live audio director for New Spring Church here in lovely Anderson, South Carolina. And that was a wonderful experience getting to mentor many campus audio folks, volunteers, getting to pass on some things that I've learned to them. And I really, really enjoyed that time there. I still see them quite often and help anywhere I can. I write for Church Sound and Live Sound International magazine. I have a monthly column called Talk and Yak in Live Sound, and a column in Church Sound called, funny enough, The Mix Institute. So I love doing that. I wrote a book many, many years ago. If you've ever seen that book, I have.
I highly recommend you get this book. Okay, highly recommend it.
It's a tips and tricks kind of book, more application based, and that's the way I like to teach. So hopefully you'll feel the same when we go through this today. And yes, the Mix Institute, we're just kicking off. We're a house of worship based audio school, and we're going to focus in on mixing. Not so much Audio 101, but we're really going to dive into learning some great techniques for mixing. So we're going to launch that very, very soon. We've got, if you go to themixinstitute.com, you can see our upcoming first workshop, August 22nd, here in the Greenville, South Carolina area. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mixing for houses of worship. Very first point, very important, that it is very important to have high quality audio in houses of worship. Raul was mentioning John Lewis's funeral today, and the fact that this is very apropos that we're talking about this, because we're be watching things from a church, and how important it is to have the music, the speakers, their lavalier mics, their headset mics, all the different artists. It's such an important thing to have high quality audio. It's the one place above all where sound should be great. And people who have gone to churches where the sound is great, or have weekly have just amazing audio in their church, they know how important that is. And when you go visit another church where things aren't maybe quite so good, you really learn how much you miss that. So let's say things aren't so great, and you're new, and you're trying to get up to a level where things are just better than they currently are. So how can you quickly and dramatically improve your mix? And that's kind of what this presentation is all about. It's called the top 5 things you can do to improve your mix right now. Let's dive in. So tip number 1, test, measure, and EQ, then balance your PA system. This is the building block. This is the first thing that has to be right before anything else is going to go right. And I just wanted to say, as I was writing this, it occurred to me that one question we may get is, well, what can I do if I can't access the tools to do this kind of stuff? What if I can't really change the balance of the components? Well, you do what you can. And if you're able to put your various speaker component zones on matrices and EQ that way, or time align that way, that's what you can do. If you have the tools, a speaker processing system, for example, to be able to kind of get at it a little more, fine tuning, that's the preferred method for sure. But there's always a way. You can take something and find a way to make it sound better. So first thing you want to do always is test. And by that, I mean, you want to ensure all components are functioning before you really get going. This maybe is one of those steps that gets missed when you're working in the same church auditorium every week. You go in, you fire everything up, and people dive in and start sound checking or rehearsing. But I implore everyone to periodically, if not every time you turn the sound system on, just make sure everything is working properly. Sometimes an amp will just power down overnight, or won't power up in the morning, and you got a whole zone of mid-range speakers not working. That's not going to be good for your mix. So just make sure things are always working with pink noise, and make sure that your signal flow is correct. I like to use matrices for my speaker zones. My left-right goes to my main left cluster, my main right cluster, subs, front fills, out fills, they all get run from a matrix. So gives you a little more flexibility and fine-tuning ability if you have things on a matrix. So especially if you're doing a one-off event, maybe, especially now with a lot of church services happening in parking lots and drive-ins and things like that, a lot of times we're maybe getting away from our installed speaker system and setting things up just for a single event. So this is always something you want to check. You want to make sure your matrix is going to the right amplifiers, which are going to the right speaker group. And then when you got everything tested and sound is coming out of everything, this is the one last step I always do before I start measuring and tuning, is just have a listen. Does the big left cluster sound like the big right cluster? And you'd be surprised, and I'm sure Raul will concur, how often
Yes.
This is not the case.
Yes.
All right. From there, once we got everything working, you want to measure NEQ. And again, if you're in an installed system in a church that things don't often change, a lot of times this stuff is locked out to you. You can't really get in there and do a whole lot. But if I visit a venue, when I'm on tour, if I go to a theater that has an installed system, I never miss this step. I always get out my Rational Acoustic Smart, or if you prefer another FFT measurement software system, I always measure the PA and do some EQing before I ever listen to an input through the console. If you don't have a measurement system, which, a lot of folks don't, I didn't have one for many, many years, had to use my ears, trusted music track, and my voice as a reference. And, got us all by for many, many years before we were able to start accurately and clinically looking at measurements. I like to start with the main portion of the PA and one side only. Place my measurement mic in a good spot that is picking up the sort of the meat of that zone of PA. So if you've got a very tall, long line array in an arena or in a very big auditorium, sometimes front of house is not a bad place to start, just to take your first measurement. I'll store that measurement trace, and then I'll delay and EQ as needed as I go through all of these zones. I'll move on to subs, front fills, other fills, and I'll adjust each until I have them all nicely well time aligned and tonally balanced. And this is one spot where I wanted to mention that just because a speaker zone sounds good on its own doesn't mean it's going to sound great when they all start combining, because low end likes to build up and high end doesn't build up quite the same way. So if you make your front fill sound great, your out fill sound great, your delays sound great, they're all big full frequency, and then you start turning them all on, you're going to have a lot of overlapping and coupling of the low frequency. So in that step of adding things together, just make sure that you're paying attention to that. And that's where this next step, balance, comes into play. You want to make sure that when you feel like you're there with your various zones, turn it all on, play some music, walk around the room, and listen to see if the volume and EQ is uniform in every seat. And you definitely want to listen to those transition zones as you move out of the main speakers and you're going down front and you move into the front fills. Does it sound the same? Is the volume the same? Is the frequency spectrum the same? There's the same amount of highs down there as there is further in the room. And then this is where you're just going to adjust things a little bit. Maybe you have a tablet computer and you're able to walk around and balance things, or you run a few laps back and forth from the zones back to the console. But you want to adjust the volume and the EQ until you hear everything as a nice even blend. And here we go. Big exclamation mark on subs. This is the tough one to get right. And a lot of times your hands are very much tied. It's hard to get even sub bass coverage from side to side and front to back. It's just tough. You all know sitting at front of house or standing at front of house when you mix, you're often in a +6, +9 dB of sub frequencies zone. And as you move 10, 15 feet to the right, all of a sudden you're in a big sub hole, and it's tough. It's tough to make your mix decisions. But if you can move things around a little bit, if you have the ability to do zone delay, so as you're moving out from center, you can add a little bit of zone to delay to each one of those clusters to try to spread the image throughout the room. That's you're probably not going to do this every time you walk in to this same rehearsal, but this is something that you can maybe do one time and get it right and be in good shape there. And then very, very important, this one, blend the subs in with the PA at equal volume or just a touch louder. You'll often find PAs with a ton of low end in it, and it makes everything else much tougher after that. So if you can get your subs, lows, mids, and highs all to be fairly equally balanced. This is the stage that you want to get this done before you move on. So tip one, Raul, you got any thoughts?
Jim, I was gonna say, in addition to those great fundamentals on balancing the tonality of the PA, I think it's important, a couple of things. Number one, that before we start working on the mix, that we actually get to know some of the room acoustics of the room that you're in. Some churches have some significant front to back reflections, sometimes side to side reflections, and that's kind of the way it is. So you kind of need to be aware of that. I think it's also important that we take the time to go over to the area where the band is going to be at, where the pastor is going to be preaching from, and actually listen to your music, from that location. Have a clear understanding of what the subs or the low mid is doing in that area for where people are preaching or the choir is singing. It's important because a lot of that frequency content is going to end up in your mics. So you want to be aware of that. Plus, if the musical director is talking to you about something doesn't feel right, maybe it's because there is a coupling of the low mids or a coupling of the subs where they are, playing from. So take the time not only to walk the house to look at, to know the room acoustics, but also to put yourself in the shoes of the preacher as well as the band so you can relate to them. And then lastly, of course, before you start mixing, make a sort of a mental picture, sonic picture of how your mix position is different from, many of the key seating areas. Have a reference so that when you're mixing, like you said, if you're mixing in a power alley, area, okay, well, how do you relate that to the front seat of the audience and so forth? So I think that, that in these particular type of houses of worship, and we're talking about houses of worship with contemporary music, right? Is not my parents, parents' very basic small Catholic church. Today's contemporary music, could be exactly like a full-on concert.
Absolutely.
And so, it just requires us to actually do a little further of knowing the venue and kind of working with the pastor and the band. So
right. No, it's a great point. And I think, one of the main things I do every time I'm in a venue is that walk to the first null, right? That first 15-foot off-center spot where the subs or the lows of the PA are canceling out. And I try to get a feel, and I'll do it during my tuning music, but I'll also, once the band is kind of settled a little bit, I'll walk over there and go, okay, what are these people in this really bad cancellation spot hearing subwise? And then I'll walk all the way to the edge of the venue and hear it kind of come and go and try to, like you said, get a sonic picture in your mind of how much do I have to add or take away low end wise, especially at front of house, to make it the best for most of the other seats.
Yeah, and in many churches, frankly, that we have visited, sometimes the mix position is not in the best spot.
Right.
You might be to one side, you might be on a balcony. I have seen some that are inside a booth. So, like I said, you're not always going to get dead center with very even left or right balance. So,
right, and you might have a hollow floor underneath you, and you're standing or sitting, and the whole thing is shaking, and you step out of the front of house, and there's nothing going on out there. There's no sub, so you got to make it almost uncomfortable for you. And like you said, the musical director who is up there, trying to get the band to play their best and to get the monitor mixes right in their ears or their wedges. What kind of overtones are you sending back there? I wrote an article for Live Sound International that was called 360-degree tuning. And that one was about taking the time to get on stage, get behind the speakers and hear what's happening there. Because the one place I've probably been burned more than ever is, low frequencies and low mid energy coming off front fills, and what that does to an acoustic guitar or a cello or
Absolutely, especially with distributed systems. I mean, nowadays, of course, the advent of line array technology, when possible in some modern churches, they have some line array systems that help control some of that low mid energy. But on a lot of pre-existing distributed systems, you're going to have a good amount of low mid energy
Yes.
everywhere. So just be knowledgeable about that before you start on to the next section.
Right. And here we are, the next section. Tip number 2, this is very, very important. Lay the groundwork with great gain structure. And I'm sure we have some folks out there who have many, many years mixing and putting a mix together and getting it from the input on stage to the speakers with a lot of experience in this, but a lot of newer audio engineers and volunteers who are, just say, I want to learn how to do this. And, this is something that they hear a lot, but maybe don't quite understand. I think the best way I can explain it is trying to get your levels as they go through all the stages of the console to be at good working levels, not too low, not clipping. And as you move from the input of the console through to the groups, your DCA controls to your master output to your speaker processor to your speakers through the amps. All of those stages, you want to be balancing those levels so they all work well together. So we'll start out with input channels. So we're just going to kind of pretend we're dialing in our first input here. Let's say the first thing we listen to is a vocal. So you go to that channel, everything's flat on it. You grab your gain preamp knob, and with the fader down and maybe a pair of headphones on, you just start adjusting your gain preamp level. So you get a nice meter reading with medium intensity input. So let's say your singer is just singing at sort of their 70% level where they usually are in sound check, and then jumping up to 90% for service time, as we all know that happens. But with just a good solid bit of input, you want to try to get your meter on your input for that channel to read around 0 dB analog or -18 or -16, whatever your digital is calibrated to. But and then just most consoles will have a definite color change on the meter at this point. You usually go from green to yellow when you get around this area. So you just want to have your medium intensity stuff sitting around 0 dB, and then leave a little room for peaks. Things like a snare drum is one of those things that'll get you where, the drummer's not giving you a whole lot during the sound check, but then they'll really lay in. So you always want to make sure you have a little room so you're not going to hit a red light when things are really getting hairy, but you also want to make sure it's not reading too low, because if you have too low a gain preamp setting and then you take that fader and jack it all the way up, you'll introduce noise and hiss and hum and all kinds of things. So now you're going to bring your fader up. Now that you got your preamp gain set nice, bring your fader up near the 0 dB mark on the fader, and just kind of pay attention to where you are now. If the PA is too loud just with this one input, you might want to just make a quick adjustment on the master fader to just get yourself started. And then you're going to do this for all of your inputs. Now, we haven't really talked much about groups yet, but that's where we're going next. So if you've got a good preamp level set for all your inputs, you'll probably notice that there is a fair amount of coupling. Summing was the word I was looking for. A lot of summing of the inputs here, and this is where you're going to notice is at the master bus. If you've got all of your inputs reading a little above 0, you're probably going to find at this point that your master bus is starting to hit pretty hard. So this is where you can do a little work with groups and your DCAs to help you manage all this level. So in music mixing, a lot of times we'll put all our drums to a stereo group, our guitars, keys, vocals, background vocals to a stereo group, and that gives us another stage for gaining, for EQ, for maybe a little processing like a compressor, or some nice flavor. You can do those things on your groups instead of having to do them on the individual input. And you had a good point earlier, Raul, about groups.
It's a critical thing. I find that if it used to be that we had maybe a guitar player or a keyboard player at a church and a couple of vocal microphones and the pastor, but now it's a full-on concert. So basically setting yourself up for success, you can quickly access a group of instruments. It's very key. I mean, for you and I spent a lot of time mixing on analog consoles with lots of inputs. You had your Midas, I had a Gamble, and it was all through groups. Everything went through all groups. We used groups a lot. Even if we were mixing on VCAs,
right.
We were still grouping things just to quickly address some dynamics. If we had a brass section, I know some churches have brass section now, so we have a big choir. If you have a couple of podium mics, if you have a lavalier, all grouping things actually gives you the ability to have an extra layer of equalization,
right?
Or dynamic
compression.
Control.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But like you said earlier, it's important. The gain structure again comes in very importantly, where we have walked into some places where you can see that the input faders are, down to -15, but all the groups are at 0. And the master fader is up at 0. So your gain structure is kind of tilted a little bit.
Right.
So you have to kind of work on that and rebalance that a little bit.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I like to teach volunteers and early audio engineers about the sort of the marking on the fader. As you logarithmically turn a fader up or down, you'll notice that once you get below -10, the markings are much closer together. So -20 comes to you a lot faster than it did between 0 and -10. And if you get into that zone where all your faders are down too low, just the slightest little adjustment on that fader is like 8 dB, where if you can manage to set your preamp so that all your faders are hovering around the 0 on the input, and use your groups and your DCAs to balance things. That's exactly what Raul was getting at there. So, and then if you're still too loud at this point, you can turn your master down even a little more. So I usually end up, the way I set my gain structure, I almost always have my master at about -6, and I have my DCAs from 0 to -6, somewhere in that area.
I do the same thing you do, or the matrix sections, when I'm feeding for all the TV award shows, everything out of matrices. That way I can keep my mix kind of consistent. And the question is, well, is it too loud? Is it not too loud? But I can go to my matrix without affecting the mix and just, turn the PA down or turn the PA up. So the mix stays the same. I'm just turning the volume up or down.
Right. And this comes in very handy for recordings as well. Let's say that because of the acoustics of your room, you never have enough guitars in or keyboards or brass, or it just never translates to what the folks at home who aren't there for the service, or if they're listening later on a recording, and they say, wow, I always hear the drums and I always hear the vocals, but I don't hear I don't hear the stuff in the middle. If you have groups, you can send more of that to your record matrix, and you can adjust your recordings that way. So,
yeah, it's almost like having a second console.
That's right. So let's say you've done all that stuff, and the PA is still too loud. This is where the steps after the console come into play. Most sound systems these days have some sort of software and or connectivity to the amplifiers, or in the good old days when Raul was less gray and I had more hair, we used to have crossovers, and we would we would use the crossovers as another gain stage. So you could turn the levels up or down on your crossover to match it to the speaker and the room that you're in. These days, like I said, it's mostly done either if you're using powered speakers, then you usually are going to want to have some kind of something in between your console and the speakers to adjust levels, or the processing software in a laptop, you can adjust what the amplifiers are doing through the software. That's kind of our gain structure section. Raul, do you want me to keep going, or you?
Absolutely. This is my favorite section coming up. I'm telling you, if we could get everybody to use the high pass filter, we would fix the problems of the world. That's
right. The high pass filters are in audio are like masks to help our society right now. Here we go.
Yes.
So we want to start with high pass filter. It's an unbelievably powerful, often overlooked tool. Especially, we're going to assume as we go through the rest of this presentation that we have our PA in a nice balance, because as you'll see in a bullet point here soon, if that's not right, this affects the high pass filters very much. But let's go again. We're going to turn a vocal up in the PA. Start there. You might have to engage a switch or click on a screen or something to engage that high pass filter. But then you're going to want to roll it up and get your corner frequency up until you start to reduce the mud in that frequency. And it's very easy to hear with vocals, I think, more than things like keyboards. Sometimes you'll think you got that right, but then they're playing way down on the lower notes, and you find that you have to adjust that a little more. But with a vocal, if you've got a full voiced singer, you can usually go in there and adjust that and hear that pretty clearly. And this is what I was mentioning. If the PA is tuned without a lot of excessive low end tilt, your high pass frequencies, those numbers will be less and less severe. But if you have a bass heavy system, you'll be rolling that high pass filter up and up and up, and you're going, wow, I still can't get rid of the mud in this vocal, or the boominess or the popping that happens from a podium mic.
Yeah. Jim, in some consoles, it's also very important to check. I mean, different consoles, different flavors, but
right.
Know the slope of your high pass filter. Some consoles have a slope, that is adjustable, right? Whether it's 12 dB per octave or 18 or 24 or whatnot. Others do not. Otherwise, it's a fixed slope. So you kind of have to know that ahead of time to figure out, okay, how deep do you have to, how far up in frequency do you have to go to get the effect, the cleanup effect that you want.
Right, because if it's a very steep slope, you're going to find I'm rolling the frequency up higher and higher, and I'm not really hearing it. But then all of a sudden, it's there and it's taken care of. But a less severe slope in your high pass filter, you're going to start to hear it happen, and then you'll get to the right point. That's a really good point, Raul. So let's say you have a nicely balanced PA that you took care of yourself. So with your vocals, you should expect to be somewhere in the 80 hertz to 200 hertz range, depending on, a lot depends on the singer, what type of voice do they have, and the microphone. There's so many things that come into play here. But 80 to 200 should be a pretty good spot. And again, if you have to roll your high pass filter up much higher than 200, consider turning the subs and lows down in the PA, or EQing some of that out if you don't have level control on the lows of your sound system. This is a good one here. So this is EQing to create space. listen to each input, and you probably did some of this while you were setting your high pass filters, but you want to do a little minimal EQ to start improving the sound of each one of your inputs as you go along. You don't want to do too much here at this point because you still have to blend all these inputs together, and that's gonna make you force you, guide you into touching up EQ so it all fits together nicely. But at this stage, we're just going to use a little bit of EQ to make each input sound great. And when you've got them sounding good by themselves, then you want to start combining things that have a similar frequency characteristic, like kick drum and bass guitar, or piano and guitar. You want to start working, you probably have a systematic way you go through your line check, but once you have line check, this is where you might want to start working on groupings of instruments that have similar characteristics. And you want to see if you can maybe remove a little high mid from one, or boost a little low mid on another. Maybe do some sort of opposite things with things that sound similar, so that you give each instrument its own space in the mix. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, Raul, but like with guitars, I sometimes find if I just pull a little high mid, add a little low mid to it, and then treat the keyboard or the tracks slightly different, then I get some separation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of tricks, and I'd like to steal some of the phrase from Pooch, which he goes, he doesn't like to have too many instruments share the same, spectral area. So try to make a pocket, to actually give a little, spectral space to each particular instrument. Another thing that I also recommend in this section, if your console has that feature, is to use a low pass filter. Sometimes that comes in very handy, to remove, cymbals from vocal mics, or from guitar mics, or, not just high passing, a particular vocal or guitar mic, but also low passing things could actually help clean your mix before you start EQing. Right. So that's something that it's come in very handy on the VI consoles. So thank you, Tom, for that. The other thing that I think is very important to notice with the high pass filter, I think it's important that if you're kind of learning, you're starting, is to make sure that you know the microphone. What microphone are you working with? Is it a D5? Is it a 58? Is it a beta? What is the proximity effect? Right. So you just take the time to grab the mic, know the mic yourself, figure out how does it feel when you're 6 inches away from it, when you have it really close, how the low mid proximity effect builds up. How does that change in the sound system, so that when you're working with the musicians and the singers and or the pastor, you can actually communicate with them and say, hey, just back up a little bit, or maybe you're too close, because you already know the mic, what the cause of this is. So take the time to do your homework on that.
It's a great point. And know that if if they're singing in an SM58 and somebody runs out a Neumann microphone, that it's a very different animal. And yes. So like you said, take the time. Maybe you got an afternoon where it's just you and the console in the room, and just listen to each mic in the PA, just to get a feel for that. And they all have different sort of openness to them. Some will want to feedback and take off a little sooner than other mics, just based on the way they're built. So that's a good one, Raul. All right, I'm going to move on to tip number 4. This is sort of a multi-part, all crammed into one tip, but we'll get through it. So you want to start by building a solid foundation with drums and bass. Then you want to create a musical middle. We'll get to that. That's a very intriguing sounding term. And then finish it all off with vocals on top. So let's start with drums and bass. So I'm sure many heads will nod up and down out there about it all starts with a great sounding drum kit. And with all of these instruments and vocalists, always, if you have a professional musician, a professional singer, or somebody who just has really worked on their craft, it helps so much to have good inputs. Good in, good out. I'll use that analogy versus we've heard the negative side of that statement as well. So,
Yeah.
If you have the time to work with the drummer backstage, pre-service, pre-sound check and rehearsal, and just kind of listen, how does the kit sound? Are the toms tuned to a nice note? Do they all work together, or is stuff, are lugs rattling and the drum head hasn't been changed in 2 months? Just do what you can. And this is another one of those things where you can't always control this side of it. You may get what you're going to get and go from there. But so let's start with the kick drum. Everyone loves a good kick drum. I like to always use 2 mics. We don't always get that opportunity. And what I do if I don't get to have 2 mics, one inside and one in the hole of the drum, is I will split that into 2 channels. Just I'll take that one input and assign it to 2 channels so that I have a little bit of control. And I'll actually I'll EQ those and process those 2 channels a little differently. And even if it's just one mic, I'll call it in and out. And that just I'll usually EQ the in mic to have a little bit more attack and a little less sub and low end. And then the outside mic, the one in the hole, I'll EQ with a nice round thump. But what you want to do is, let's say you have 2 mics or 2 channels. You want to listen to each one individually first and make each one of those sound as good as they can on their own before adding them together. If you do add them together, 2 things to check. It used to be that all we ever had on an input was a polarity switch or a phase switch. That is not the case anymore. Now, almost every console will have input delay, which I find 9 times out of 10 to be the better choice when trying to combine 2 very similar inputs. But, I will do this, especially if I have 2 different mics, like an inside and an outside. I'll just flip the polarity and see what that does for me first. A lot of times, like I said, I'll end up with leaving the polarity the same and going to the input delay and working on that. But let me just say this one thing before we talk much more about combining these 2 things. I say only combine 2 similar inputs, like 2 guitar mics or a bass DI and a bass mic, or a kick in and a kick out. Only use both if you have to. If one of those inputs sounds great on its own, a lot of times you're going to get in way less trouble if you just use that one mic, because when 2 inputs that are similar combine and they're not completely phase aligned, you will get cancellation somewhere. And so you're going to have to use the input delay to shape that sound. And I see you doing a lot of nodding there, Raul.
You know what? Especially in church services where you got to keep your attention on the pastor and everything else, simplicity is king. So I know that we all want to have 28 channels of drums, and paddle, bus compression, and everything else. But let's not lose sight of yes, we can make the drum sound good with just one kick drum mic.
Right. Yes, and we did it for a long time, and with polarity, you with the polarity switch, you get 2 possible results. You get better or worse, and if you leave the polarity both positive, and some frequencies are canceling, and then you flip it, and now some frequencies are better and some others aren't. So using one input is sometimes just a simpler and it's less things, like you said, less things to think about when everything is going on. But if you are gonna combine them, use the input delay. And what I like to say is you can actually tune the kick drum a little bit with input delay. You just move that a little bit on that inside mic, and you can actually kind of change things so that it's summing and it's more in proper polarity at 40 hertz or 80 hertz. And just by moving the input delay, you can adjust the sound of your kick drum that way. So snare, same thing, one mic or two. Most of us get to have two mics, and there's a good reason to have a bottom snare mic. You don't quite get the nice zippy sizzle of the snares without a bottom mic. But if you are using just a snare top, you can still get that to sound quite nice. If you do use a bottom mic, just remember 9 times out of 10, you'll have to reverse that polarity. I find the only time you don't have to reverse it is if something is right. Wired wrong, or it's a maybe you got a bad mic cable or something. But almost always, if you got one pointing down and one pointing up, you're going to have to flip that polarity. You want to again tune that snare really nice, so you got a nice thick tone. Whoa, got a little. Okay, there we go. So you want to tune it so it's a nice thick, nice pleasant sound with a good crack in the high mid, and then add in that bottom snare mic for a little extra depth. I'll actually use the snare bottom mic to kind of help with that nice 200 hertz range and get a little extra thickness out of the drum, and then I'll add in that sizzle on the top, and that's usually a nice combination. All right, toms, like we said before, tuning, very important. Toms are kind of made to resonate at a certain note, and if you can get them tuned to that note and then find that note, that frequency in the PA, I usually do a little tiny bump on the low end EQ right where that resonant note is, and let that be its signature sound. So if you got 4 different toms, sometimes the highest one will be, I'll have a little boost at 120 and then 100, then 80 as you go down. At this point, if things are kind of crazy, you might dampen that drum a little bit with a little moon gel or some well-placed gaff tape. So EQ tips, like I said, find that resonant note on the bottom, pull out some boxiness, 300 to 500. If you kind of sweep through there, you'll find a place where it kind of doesn't sound so pleasant usually on most drums. And I'll add a touch of 5K for clarity attack, and maybe a little noise gate to further control the delay if necessary. Sometimes it's nice to have noise gates on just set real loose, just so when no one's at the drum kit, you don't hear the tom sitting there ringing and on their own.
Jim, it's always a good thing to take the time to chat with your drummer, before you go and spend, an hour twisting knobs on gates and EQing the toms, to its final hour. Perhaps you can go and have a chat with your drummer and say, hey, can you tune up, tune down? Can you kind of dampen this yourself a little bit, especially in the kick? I have had many conversations with drummers, and you find that I say, look, I'm trying to not gate your drums or over EQ your drums. And they go, oh, great. What do you need me to do? Oh, sure. I'll move this pillow and, I'll put a little bit of tape on my toms. And all of a sudden now your drum kit, it just saved you a lot of work just by having a nice chat with the drummer.
Right. Yeah. On every instrument on stage as well. And sometimes if you're new to a church or you're just filling in for someone, sometimes that conversation's a little tougher to have, because you're maybe shy about going down there and trying to ask someone to make changes. But maybe after maybe after sound check too, you can say, if you just did a little more of this and tighten this up a little bit, we'd all be better off for it. And
absolutely,
yeah, for sure. It's a good point. Bass guitar. Oh, this one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. Room acoustics can make this very, very difficult. So,
and yet it's so important to have it as a fundamental on the mix.
Absolutely.
So many things sit on top of it.
Yeah. Some of my favorite mixes I've ever heard over the years have been, a great sounding kick drum, but the bass is the thing that moves you. It just is emotional, the way you can fill that whole low end of the mix with a great sound in bass guitar. And that's my next point. Jumping off what you were saying there with talking to the musician or the musical director. Bass guitar is one of those instruments that it has to fit the music.
Right.
You have different styles of music. Sometimes, like Sting always had a big, round, thick, reggae bass sound. That's what he liked. Not a lot of mids and highs, and that was his choice. And other types of music, there's enough room in the middle of the sonic picture that you can have more growl and attack on the bass, and it gives it a cool characteristic. But that sound doesn't always fit. So if you're finding that, there's too much pick clack or too much just mid stuff, and it's not really accentuating the music in a way that you like, this is maybe where you ask the musician or the musical director to just work on that sound. I like to ask bass players to have a couple sounds easily accessible, with the tone knobs or with pickups or with pedals. Hey, in this song, I think we'd be better off with a deeper bass sound, and in this one, we have some space. Maybe you can add a little mid and clarity. So work with your musicians if you're able. And this is a huge one. Getting the sonic spectrum of the bass guitar to work well with the kick drum. A lot of times the kick is kind of a fixed entity. It'll be tuned to a note, it'll be dampened, and that's what you're going to get every time it's hit. But the bass guitar is going to move up and down the frequency spectrum. So you want to do kind of what Pooch was saying here. You want to give each instrument its place. The bass will overlap the kick frequency on certain notes, but sometimes you can choose that you want your kick to be subby and your bass to be more low, or vice versa. You might EQ your kick at 65, 70 hertz to give you a nice upper chest thump instead of all that sub, and then you let your bass have that other area.
Jim, and also the fact that you have to know what your room can tolerate. It's exactly. Like that area from 30 hertz, because now we have sound systems and subs that will take you down to 30 hertz. It's not an EDM show. So it's important that that area from 30 to 100, how you're going to manage that. Because even though it's just a kick drum and a bass, those two can overwhelm the room, and you can just have a standing frequency or something that is just going to resonate in the space, and all of a sudden you have everything shaking for no reason. Right. And so it's important that sometimes we've done it, we would just take, just a frequency sweeper and just kind of sweep the room and figure out, okay, look, 55 hertz, this room doesn't like that note. So just know ahead of time, what you might run into with some instruments. You might have to high pass things higher than you would like just because the room doesn't tolerate that.
Right.
Okay. The other thing is definition on the low end is a tricky thing, right? So you have to have that great balance of, like you were saying, some of the growl, some of the mid-high section versus the low end. So it's a question of whether can you tell the notes, right, rather than just, is there a bunch of low frequency content happening right, without definition. And
tracks are such a big thing now too, supporting tracks. You'll have maybe a percussion, or we call it the drum tracks that are coming from a playback machine that may have so much 30 and 40 hertz in them.
Sure.
You're like, oh my gosh, I can't even hear my acoustic kick and my bass. So those all have to work together. And like you said, the room may not allow for some things, and you have to defensively EQ. Another important point is, the way the notes are played. Is the bass player the type of player who, plays and kind of mutes as he goes along, or does he let things hang? Because sometimes that hanging note will kind of set off a floor tom, or,
Yeah, absolutely. Also know if your bass, you're doing a 4-string bass, or you're doing a 5th-string, and you're having that open B of it, so you kind of have to also know the instrumentation and figure out, okay, that very, low note is going to resonate, so I'm going to high pass a little higher. I'll give up a little bit of the 32 hertz just to keep things in control. We don't need to shake the pastor's hair today.
Right. And like you said, what's it doing on stage, very important. A lot of stages are hollow. And so if the subs, and some stages have the subs underneath the stage. So this is all affecting everything. And then if you have a piano up there, a grand piano or a baby grand, and you've got microphones, it all can get kind of hairy. And that's definitely the place where that's going to mostly occurs between the drums and the bass. Same thing here. If you have two sources on the bass, like a DI and a mic, or I've had many situations where I took a direct signal straight off the bass into one DI, and then another signal after it passed through all the pedals. This is a thing where you want to pay attention to polarity. If you have two signals, let's say DI and mic, try the polarity switch, work on the input delay, get those things to couple together in the best way in the frequencies where you want them. And you can use it to your advantage sometimes to get rid of some notes that are kind of hanging by playing with the input delay.
Jim, I was going to ask you, when you work with your worship band, do you encourage them to go like no amplifiers on stage, to go full DI and just have even in-ear monitors, or just a few wedges?
Yeah. I must say that most of the worship music mixing that I have done has been in a fill-in role. So they'll send me out to a campus and say, hey, our audio engineer needs a week off. Will you go and cover that week? So I walk into a lot of situations where they've got an established system. I haven't had a whole lot of opportunities where I work with them week in and week out and get to dictate those things. But yes, especially with the new, Kempers and fractals and these devices that are available. You can get a great sound and have no stage volume. And
yeah, exactly. Very clean stage, which kind of helps you dial a better mix overall ultimately, because you don't have a lot of competing acoustical sources coming from the stage.
Right. So. And let's just quickly circle back to the drum kit again. That's probably going to be the loudest thing on stage. So encouraging the use, the suggestion that the drum kit doesn't wipe everything else out. They're, like you said, modern contemporary worship music, it can be like a rock concert, and there can be a drummer up there swinging away pretty hard, using a drum shield, or just encouraging them to play a little quieter and keeping mics away from the drum kit. Things like that will definitely help a lot.
Excellent.
All right, let's move on to the musical middle. So this is something I'm very very near and dear to my heart in the way that I mix. You want to make sure that everything between the kick drum and the vocals sounds musical. Now that sounds really obvious, but I'm sure a lot of people can say I've been to many concerts, many church worship music services where I heard the kick drum and I heard the vocal and I saw a bunch of other people up on stage playing something, but I just didn't really hear it. And so I really encourage people when they're trying to improve their mix to, having a great kick drum sound, everyone loves that. And having wonderful vocals is so important. But there's all this stuff in the middle. And if you can get that to sound sort of album quality as far as the way it all sits together, you can hear separate instruments and you can look up and say, I see that acoustic guitar, and I can see what the piano player's hands are doing. I can hear those instruments, but sometimes they just don't gel. And this is where you want to just spend some time, like you said, find pockets of frequencies that those things can sit in, but make sure that when you get it all together, it sounds musical, and it doesn't sound lopsided or too bright, too dull. It's probably the part of mixing that is the most difficult, is getting all of those things to sit together. And like I was saying, drums are so important for impact, and the vocals and the lyrics are so vital, but it's a song. In the end, it's a song. So be sure the instrumentation provides the melody and the key signature of the song. What do you got? What do you got, Ro?
My favorite. We came to listen to the vocals. Nobody left singing the kick drum.
Right. Yes. Exactly right. And lead kick drum. I've heard that one said a few times. Yeah. Guy had a good lead kick drum sound. It's very true. And here we are. We're going to finish it all off with vocals on top. It's got to be this way. Worship music is about the worship and the message and the word. So we got to do this. If the PA, again, I'm saying it again, and people who know me, this is a broken record, but if the PA system is well tuned, sonically balanced, getting the vocals to sit on top of the mixes, it's much easier if you start from that point. So as you're listening to vocals, maybe you've done your line check, you've set your gain, you've set your high pass, but now you're trying to get that vocal to sit on top with the rest of the band playing. Just double check your preamp level. You may be getting a different level than you got in sound check. Double check your high pass filter. Now that you got everything else going, maybe you have to bump that up a little bit, or maybe you went too much with the high pass and you can lower that a bit to get some warmth back. And sometimes a little trick I like to do is when I feel like my vocals just getting lost a little bit with everything else going on, I'll just add a little bit of high frequency, sometimes in a shelf, or just pick something, like 10 or 12K, and just give it a little nudge up there just to give it some air, something to get it to sit up there a little more, and maybe pull a little bit of low mid. Like I said, lead vocal is so important for the clarity, so that the lyrics are always heard. One thing I like to do is sonically separate the background vocals from the lead vocal. And this is tough when you have singers changing from worship song to worship song. You have a different person come forward, and sometimes you got them assigned to VCAs and effects, and this is a little tougher. But maybe this is a place where you're using snapshots for each song, so that you can do this. But I like to EQ that lead vocal so it's nice and clear and crisp. The lyrics are heard. And then I'll take the background vocals, and I sometimes will roll off the highs and the sibilants a little bit, make them warmer, and then pan them out of the center to create a little more space for the lead vocal. And also, I've heard this a lot where you have 5 or 6 people up there singing, and you've got this big full frequency tonality for all of those background singers, and they start singing together, and you get this big old buildup of lows and low mids. So just be aware of that and use a little more high pass filter if needed. And then a touch of compression helps keep it all in line. I like to always start with minimal compression, -3 to -6 dB of compression at the most, and then use a little bit of makeup gain to level things off. And I'm looking with my compression to give me some transient control. So when someone really jumps on that mic, it's going to take care of that. And also just leveling off that vocal, bringing the quieter stuff up a little and knocking back the louder stuff. And one thing I always check when I got a compressor set on a vocal especially is popping that insert in and out on the compressor just to make sure that I haven't affected it too much, and being very aware of makeup gain. If you go much more than 2 or 4 dB of makeup gain, sometimes you can get into a little feedback trouble with that. Any more thoughts on vocals before?
I think one of the very simple key effect is I like to keep my band on on not only on groups, but also on a separate, VCA. So I'm never afraid of, I remember when I started mixing off Broadway, they always taught me, I said, look, the fact that you know the lyrics to all the songs doesn't mean that the audience knows the lyrics to all the songs. So make sure in my head that the lyrics sit above the mix. And so at some point in time, I know that balance of band versus vocals, I want to be able to execute that very easily, very quickly, to just minor adjustment of maybe a couple of dB on the band VCA, just to make sure that the vocals just, stand out, without having to change the balance of my mix. So right. The whole band VCA helps me a lot with that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've done that whenever I've worked for people whose name is on the marquee, right?
Absolutely.
Luis Miguel, Julio Iglesias.
Yes.
Singers like that, where it's more of an orchestra feel, and the star. Having the whole band on a single VCA that you can just change that balance quickly, like you said. That's a great point. Good one, Raul. Let's look at effects a little bit. This is tip number 5, album quality effects. So who hasn't heard a Celine Dion album and just said, oh my gosh, I just want my vocal effects to sound like that, If you can get this part of it right, your mix will kind of go from being, that's a nice mix, to the type of thing that brings about worship, when the effects on the instrumentation is pristine. This is a really important thing in worship music. Couple of things I like to do on drums. I like to use shorter, denser reverbs. I remember that when digital reverbs first came out, and you pull up the hall reverb and you go, wow, that sounds amazing. But, the preset was 3.5 seconds of reverb on the snare, So, we all kind of learned, I like to, when I hear an album and I hear a snare drum, especially when it's like, man, that sounds so good, but I can't even really hear the reverb. It's just a thing that's like sitting around.
It's like a texture. No, you're just kind of coloring or texturing the music, as opposed to creating an effect that detracts from the actual musicality.
Right. And for those listening who work in very ambient, reverberant auditoriums, this one maybe doesn't apply to you quite as much, but this point, if you especially if you're recording or you're streaming and broadcasting, your mixes can sound kind of dry and dull if you have a very reverberant room and you're not doing anything for the broadcast to make it sound like using audience mics or adding effects to the broadcast mix only, just to help with that. But shorter, denser reverbs definitely help. I like to use 2 reverbs on my drums. I like a shorter gated type sound and a second thicker hall, but I'll still keep that decay time fairly short. And I'll send different levels from each grouping of drums, the snares, the kicks, and the toms. I may send different aux levels to that effect just to try to pull that all together so it doesn't all kind of sound like the same thing. I'll get extra depth on your overall drum sound, but keep it from being washed out. And then, once I've kind of line checked things, if there's time, with just the drummer playing, I like to balance the return levels of the gated versus the slightly longer hall verb to get that just right. And this may vary a bit if it's more of a ballad type song or more of a pop. If it's a more upbeat sort of pop song, sometimes longer reverbs just sound kind of strange. So I'll use a little more of the gated and a little less of the hall verb and flip it for a ballad. Vocal effects. I think the big 3 are reverb, delay, and some type of chorus or harmonizing. And I'll work with a combination of those things on vocals. Like EQ and panning, I like to treat the lead vocal and the background vocals differently to give them their own space in the mix. I'll use a touch less reverb on a lead vocal with some delay and more reverb and chorus on the background vocals. This is just kind of a combination that seems to make sense for me. And then panning them out of the center, having that reverb and chorus on the background, it kind of makes them sit in a place off to the side so that the lead vocal can shine through. And then, like you were saying earlier with a low pass filter on certain things, this is a great place to use a low pass filter and a high pass filter on the effects returns, especially things like reverb and delay. What this does, if you use that low pass filter and you go down, maybe all the way down to 4K, 3K on the delay return, you get it to sit back in the mix a little bit and it sounds less obvious. You're not sitting there in the audience thinking, boy, I hear that distinct delay on that vocal. It's just something that is a texture, as you said, Raul. It adds something to the vocals, but you can't really put your finger on it. That's kind of what I like to go for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's a couple tips and tricks for vocal effects that I have learned in my many years. I like to use 2 delay returns, one set to a quarter note and one to the half note. You can usually, on modern consoles, digital consoles, you can set both of those up to receive their tempo from the tap tempo key somewhere. And some consoles will allow you to set up the delay as a quarter note or a half note. Some don't, and if it doesn't, I'll usually have 2 hotkeys. One, so I'll just tap out the quarter note, and then the second one I just kind of bounce with a half note, and that way I can have my delays bouncing in time with the song. And then I'll send to the aux for the reverb. I like to send from the main vocals, but also from the delay returns. So this way you get a pre-delayed reverb as well as the reverb that you have on the vocal, but you'll also get this bouncing reverb that's in time with the song, and it's not something you have to go in and per song adjust the pre-delay on the reverb. So And then just to help make effects sound a little more pro and a little less obvious, I like to use shorter reverb times and maybe only 1 or 2 repeats on a delay setting.
You know, Jim, I think that one of the key things that I like to always mention to music mixers at House of Worships is to remember that even though it's almost like a concert, you don't have to exchange the effects for each song like at a concert.
Right.
So try to, if you're gonna, use effects to improve your mix, try to keep them consistent throughout the service, as opposed to, every song has a different delay effect, or every, chorus effect. Is not about the effects, right? So you
Right.
want it to complement as opposed to detract from what's actually going on in the service.
Right. And worship is a fluid thing as you go from one song to the next. If you just kind of keep the congregation moving along with you in the mix, as opposed to, like you said, all of a sudden there's this, huge bounce delay going on or something. Yeah, that's a very good point. It as you're listening to the music, you should be able to sink into it and then kind of stay there and not be jarred out of that.
I think it's important, that you share, with the musical director, try to have an understanding of what, how the song is structured. Maybe they recorded it before, have a listen to it, figure out how the instruments are balanced, figure out what effects they use. Sometimes some musicians don't want any effects. So it's cool to be creative, but just remember that you're there to serve a bigger purpose.
Right. No, that's a great point. And as you mentioned, that one thing that I find happens is, we're going to go back and we're going to do this song that we did 4 years ago. And nobody kind of goes back and adjusts the tracks to the way the tracks kind of sound. Right. With the new musicians and the new musical director, and all of a sudden you'll kind of have the 3 songs in a row, and it'll be just setting a beautiful, situation for worship. And all of a sudden this song comes on where you got horns in it or something that are on the tracks so yeah, very, very important to work through each one of those audio elements with the band and the musical director and the creative people and say, are all these things, that are coming at me, is this the way you're wanting them to sound before I start trying to blend them all together? That's a great point.
Absolutely. We have a series of questions. We'll go through your wrap up and then
No, go ahead. Let's have some questions.
All right. Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes before we wrap it up, the whole thing here. But I wanted to, there's a couple of questions on that have come in on the same topic. So people wanted to know, how do you handle choirs? It's a question of, both how do you handle choirs and how do you handle, pastors that have a lapel mic? I had a couple of questions come in about, what do you do for your lapel mics, and how do you handle choir mics?
Okay. Well, with choir mics, I think feedback control is definitely one of the first things to address. How loud are you going to be able to get these mics in the PA before you start getting in trouble? So I usually work very diligently on the high pass filters on those to find out, let's say you have 4 mics for the choir, or you have, some smaller mics strung from the ceiling. And as you said, if you have the opportunity to put them on a group and you can just EQ them all as a group, that's beneficial. If not, just individually turning them up. It's kind of like miking an orchestra in a way. You want to accentuate what's coming from the stage, but never have it get out of control. You want to get the volume that you need. But I would generally get those in a group, get them EQ'd, maybe add a little bit of reverb to them just to help it all sit in the mix. And and have that on one fader. I hope that answers things.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. And I also find that, you want to know your polar pattern on these mics. You want to find a mic that has really good rejection. You try to eliminate, as much of the band or as much of the PA from getting picked up by that mic. So just know your polar patterns pretty well,
Right.
And then, of course, on consoles that have other DSP available, you might choose to use some kind of, dynamics or plugin that will actually help close the mic when nobody's singing, so that your mics are not open all the time. So
yeah, now that's a very good point. And open mics. Sometimes if you leave them open, it actually adds a little bit of ambience to everything. And if you have two songs with the choir and then you turn all those open mics off and everything sounds dry, that part of your vibe was coming from those open mics. So maybe you even just squeak those back in a little bit to
absolutely
live. We're talking of someone who has a nicely acoustic room. And then as far as the pastor's lavalier mic or headset mic, again, I think they need to be on their own group, especially if you have several people talking at once. A little headset mic or a little lavalier mic is never going to sound anything like a large vocal mic. So you need to definitely treat that differently and give it its own processing chain, EQ, maybe compression, all those things separate for that pastor's mic, and something that you can easily get to and turn on or off or up or down without affecting everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Having it in a separate group, sometimes just being able to bring that group of that lavalier mic into different zones, different matrices of the PA. You might have your entire music going to your left and right bus, and that goes even everywhere, but you might actually change the balance of the lavalier, where you might actually put it on your under balconies or upper balconies or your outside clusters or whatnot at a different balance levels to give you as much gain before feedback. All of that is very critical. Again, try different models. I mean, sometimes, it takes a while to sometimes get a pastor from a lavalier to a headset. A lot of times they don't want to have a headset. Fine, maybe there's some new technologies, some new headsets that are almost, can be noticed, that are very lightweight. So take the time to know what's modern and what is comfortable for the pastor. And if they're going to use a lavalier mic, try out different models. Figure out, can I get away with an up-knee? Do I need to have a cardioid? Is the pastor going to be moving the head all the time and I have to compress a lot? That causes a different kind of problem.
Right.
So you have to be aware. You have to know the person that's going to be using it and how far out into the audience are they going to walk? If they're going to go out off the pulpit, etc.
Right.
So
one other quick thing on that, just as far as you were saying, matrices for speaker distribution, zone distribution. A lot of times music sounds fabulous when it's big wide stereo and all this stuff. And with a lavalier mic, you may want it 3 dB louder in the center speakers of the room. Let's say you have a center cluster as opposed to the left, right, a little bit more down the center of the room and a little quieter on the sides, just to bring your attention back to that position where they're at.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the wrap up.
Okay, cool. As we've mentioned several times, a beautiful worship music, a great sounding band and wonderful singers and a great mix. It creates an environment that invites worship to happen. And above all, that's why we're there. As audio engineers, our job is to help create that environment with a professional, balanced mix free of distractions. That's a very, very big, I should have put that all in bold, free of distractions. So getting back to our comment about, lead kick drum or whatever, it's great to have certain things in the mix that sound amazing, but it shouldn't be something that pulls somebody out of that feeling of closing their eyes, bowing their head, raising their hands, worshiping, being connected to the music and the song. You shouldn't have a triangle playing off to the side at 60 dB louder than everything else that just right. breaks that that vibe you're in. When it's right, the mix it's kind of an invisible thing. The music should be what the people are hearing. That feeling of worship should be happening, but your amazing mix shouldn't be something they're maybe even thinking about. It's more of an invisible thing. And when it's right, it can be that way. And if it's not, well, ... that you're usually going to have a conversation with someone later that somebody complained about something not being right where it needs to be. So that photo kind of says it all right there. That's what we want. We want our mix to be a part of that.
Fantastic. I know that we have a few more questions. By all means, do email us. Congratulations, Jim, on your appointment to the Mix Institute. Fantastic. Once again, everybody, Jim's book, on sound reinforcement techniques. I have my own autographed copy. And so I encourage you all to get your own version. And so, please do email us with your questions so we can actually, get you lengthier answers back in a proper manner.
Great.
And so thank you so much, Jim. It's always great to spend time with you.
You too, my friend.
I hope you're staying healthy, and I hope that we see each other soon. Laura, you want to take us home?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. That was wonderful. Thank you, Will, for assisting. And thank you all for joining us on our 90th session. We're very excited about that. And as I mentioned, we have many more sessions coming up. So if you'd like to check out the calendar, it's on pro.harman.com. And there is a link on there to all of the recorded sessions as well. So thank you and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Stay
Laura.
safe. Thank you, guys.
You too, buddy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.